Particularly happy to have some of the donors with us who have helped us launch this capital campaign, and we are very excited to announce that we are launching the public phase of the campaign. And so it's a wonderful day for the seminary and for the future ministry that we all share. And so let's all clap that we're there. It's my really great privilege to introduce Jay Magnus to you. What you may not be aware of is that the Bishop for Federal Ministries is elected by the House of Bishops. And so I first met Jay when we had the election and those wonderful walkabouts that we do. And wasn't that fun? But it was very quickly clear to the House of Bishops who the right candidate was. And it's especially delightful to welcome Jay this night as an alum of the Seminary of the Southwest as well. So, yeah. Jay has a long history of ministry with the military. I won't go through his whole CV, but he has served in the Navy and with the Navy Chaplaincy Corps and many other various positions and functions in the military chaplaincy. At the time of his election, you were, canon for mission in Southern Virginia. So he brings to our community and a wonderful skill set, not just in the area in which he now works, but a true insight and appreciation for the challenges of the church as it engages its mission. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Jay Magnus. Are you wired?
That must be better. That's better. That's an improvement. Thank you very much. Technology works most of the time. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you tonight. You've seen the title, probably most of you, of what I'm going to be speaking about. I'm going to be talking about moral leadership in the temple and the public square. The reality is I've spent probably more time in the public square than in the temple because of where I've done and the assignments I've had as a Navy chaplain. Sometime back, I recall reading that it's a waste of an audience's time for the speaker to acknowledge those who have made it possible for him to be present. Well, if I don't say thank you, my mother would never forgive me for such a lack of graciousness. So, Dean Doug Travis, thank you so much for inviting me here and for the board's invitation to be here. It's a gracious invitation this evening, and it is also a pleasure for me to be here, having commenced my theological studies here at the Seminary of the Southwest some 38 years ago. And so I must acknowledge what it means to be in the midst of the faculty and student body and to be here again. Recently, I was visiting with one of my Episcopal priest military chaplains. This particular chaplain was in a year-long residential academic study program at one of the military service colleges. He asked if during my visit I would go with him and call upon the rector of the downtown parish where the military college was. And I said, of course I would. And I was delighted to see the rector in the context of a rather substantial 18th century structure where the congregation he served worshiped. After coffee and some time to get to know the rector began to describe the plight of the downtown churches in that small town. Though the town's population was stable and was actually showing some statistical increase, all of the downtown churches were losing members. He described the case of 4 parishes. 2 of the parishes were United Methodist and 2 were Evangelical Lutheran. In the case of each faith community, the 2 congregations were merging together to form one congregation, 4 into 2, because no longer were there enough members who were contributors who could pay all of the bills. He told me about the parish he served that in recent years had diminished from an average weekly attendance of 900 down to 600. To use his words, he described the situation as being nearly in free fall. Then, in a somewhat pained expression, he talked to me about the Christian megachurch out on the outskirts of town that's growing so fast that they have a problem for parking for the 2,000 plus people who will go there to worship every weekend. As an example of the congregational life of this megachurch, he described to me the Christmas Eve extravaganza. An extravaganza for which every pizza parlor in town was retained and hired to make pizzas for the overflow congregation so that they could have something to eat while they drank their lattes and their Pepsis and listened to the 200-member choir sing. He defined the confluence of these events as a tsunami that was just about to hit them. Well, we began to talk about that a bit more and more, and I asked some questions about what is it that the Episcopal Church leadership needs to do to respond to such a thing. We came up with 2 conclusions, neither one of which will fix the situation. The first was that the old ways of being church and following Christ no longer in that small town seemed to work for emerging generations. The second thing was that they were clear, he was clear, that the Calvinist light approach to Christianity was not an option either. So really, what is a Christian leader to do and to be in a situation like that? Though I appreciate the concerns of church sustainment and church growth, I'm going to leave that to someone else for the address. This evening, I want to talk about leadership and mission. The examples of good leadership I'm going to use will by no means be confined to leaders in and of the Episcopal Church, or for that matter, even confined to leaders strictly in religious vocations. Having spent the vast majority of my ministry in settings other than the Episcopal Church, I've had the opportunity to work with leaders in non-ecclesiastical and non-religious settings. And through that experience, I've learned that the best leaders I've encountered were by no means in the temple. For the most part, they were in the public square. With regard to the public square, I'm reminded of a conversation I had in 1975 about 200 yards from where we are tonight. It was in a breezeway facing on Ratherview. It was a conversation with a distinguished man of blessed memory, none other than Frank E.G. Sugano. We had just completed a class in a course on the history and theological development of the American church. In our conversation, I commented, somewhat naively I must say, that I had recently been impressed to learn that a goodly percentage of the members of the United States Congress and the United States Senate claimed to be members of the Episcopal Church. Certainly and correctly, Frank knew that in my faulty syllogism, I had just inferred that the Episcopal Church could leverage significant influence over the affairs of our country. After a brief pause, those of you who know Frank Sugano know a little bit about this pause. He looks at you and looks over to his right and then looks back at you. He said something like this: "Jay, you have just made an unreconstituted, unreflective, and therefore useless statement. In view of the fact that a little less than 2 years ago, I took up occupancy in an office on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., I'm pretty glad I had that recalibrating moment with Frank." Later, much later, what I came to realize was that Frank had exercised leadership with me that night. spiritual leadership. I hope and pray this evening that I can do justice to the distinctions between faith affiliation and action. Is there anyone here in Austin or in Texas or even in the United States who hasn't heard the pained complaint that there's a crisis of leadership in the community of faith? Well, I don't know how long that mantra has been alive and proclaimed as the theme of the self-proclaimed leadership gurus and prophets, but I can't think of a time, at least during my adult life, when I haven't heard at least some expression of that fear-based perception that we are in the midst of a crisis of leadership so significant, so great, that no human being has ever walked on this planet and experienced or seen anything like it. When I hear these mega warnings, when I read them, I really do try to take them seriously because one might be right every now and then. However, more often than not, the only thing I can conclude is that I have just read something by another anxiety producer who wants me to buy his book on leadership. Though I don't have any historical data to back this up, I suspect that every generation has its own crisis of leadership. As I see the landscape of the Christian faith community and the culture in which we live, with the emergence of each new generation, persons there have new problems and new challenges. But as well, that means they have new opportunities, new missional opportunities. Properly framed, I think each crisis we have is a missional opportunity. The crisis is an opportunity to vocalize and to demonstrate how God is breaking into the spheres of our various realities, affecting our lives, and calling us to be the agent of the divine, whose desire it is to have positive effect upon the lives of people and to be in relationship with them. As an example of that, listen to the following letter to the editor of Christian Century. This letter was written by Robert Warren of San Francisco and published in the January 25th, 2012 issue of the magazine about 2 weeks ago. It was in response to a December 2011 article by Amy Furcombe about spiritual direction, about the spiritual direction movement, to be precise. Though I know neither Mr. Warren nor Ms. Furcombe, I find that Mr. Warren's comments are interesting. And I quote, "Holy listening has gone on for too long. The rise of so-called spirituality in the churches has coincided with the fall of spiritual social work and action. Few Christian clergy and lay people are involved in movements for social change. Precious few of them are active in the anti-war movement and in movements for LGBT rights, immigrant rights, and community organization. It is ironic that the great spiritual leaders have been the most socially and politically active leaders. Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, and the Dalai Lama led the way to social change from a spiritual base. All of the books on spiritual change call for action to follow prayer and meditation. Spirituality in the church today is ingrown, self-centered, and inward-looking. True spirituality will result in the active search for peace and justice in all the corners of the world." End of quote. At any number of levels, you may or may not agree with Mr. Warren. For example, do his leadership types grab you and call you into action? Can you sum up all the requirements for leadership within the context of the demands for social justice? How does the assessment of God's intentions for our vocational expressions square with the Scriptures or with the history of God's people? Is his assessment of current religious and spiritual leaders correct? For those of you who are currently are engaged in theological studies, does his assessment of the focus of your academic and professional pursuits strike a chord? Ever since coming to this episcopacy a little less than 2 years ago, I have been engaged in conversations with other leaders and theologians, not by any means mutually exclusive pursuits, about the need for leaders who are passionately grounded in ways that renew and unite our embrace of moral, prophetic, and pastoral expressions. In fact, just to take this to the next level, I'm entertaining an idea that unless Christian persons are open to being formed in such ways, they might well consider another vocational option. As unconventional as it may seem to be, I'm looking for persons who are capable of uniting the passion of a Billy Graham with the missional acuity of H. Richard Niebuhr and the Anglican grounding of Richard Hooker. I suppose some of you might think this is a pretty tall order, which it is. But I think that the times in which we live call for this type of challenge. The challenge of these times calls for significant and appropriate leaders to take their place among us. Allow me to unpack this just a little bit. I chose Billy Graham not only because he and I are both native North Carolinians, but that's a really good place to start. And I might have ended it there, but I won't. But Mr. Graham has been passionately in pursuit of the evangelical mission to proclaim Christ for longer than most of us have been on this earth. Also, and not insignificant, is the verifiable fact that Mr. Graham has been able to exhibit a modest yet commendable ecumenical spirit in the midst of an evangelical community that's not known for that. Finally, I chose Mr. Graham because from time to time he's demonstrated an ability to change his understanding of the demands that God has upon his life and upon God's people and still maintain a passion for the proclamation of the gospel of Christ. For example, as some of you may remember, during the 1970s, a lot of Christians were in pitched battles over whether or not it is morally permissible for a nation or a state to possess nuclear weapons that potentially could be used in a responsive or preemptive strike upon a designated enemy. Mr. Graham, whose heritage is Southern Baptist and Presbyterian, had for many years expressed the conviction that it was not his responsibility to form and to express a moral attitude about our country's possession of nuclear weapons. However, in 1973 or thereabout, a convergence of events and encounters convinced him to change his position. In a very public statement, he concluded that nuclear weapons, for a variety of reasons to include their indiscriminate effect upon non-combatants, were immoral. Well, you can guess what happened next. Mr. Graham's statement evoked an absolute landslide of reaction from the evangelical Christian community. I recall reading some of the statements from some of his evangelical peers who wondered if this was Mr. Graham's first step toward the abandonment of his evangelical leanings. It was bad enough if he would organize city-to-city crusades with the cooperation of Roman Catholics and Episcopalians. Now this. Over time, though, my assessment has been that Mr. Graham's change in attitude about nuclear weapons did not appear to have even the slightest effect upon his passionate leadership style. He wasn't going to chase that rabbit. He simply made an adjustment, if you will, a course correction, and continued to pursue his missional goals to communicate and to spread the good news of Jesus Christ and the gospel. Having in mind the necessity for such a passionate approach to spiritual leadership, a bit over a decade ago, I adopted a 3-point leadership paradigm. The first requirement of that paradigm is to be very aware of where your spiritual compass is pointing and chart your course in that direction. At almost all costs, keep from being distracted and thrown off course. On the desk in my office, you will find an old and much worn Boy Scout compass, a compass that I had as a scout in the 1950s. Today, it reminds me to be aware of the course I am charting, which is my true north. Second, when significant obstacles come before you, obstacles through which you may not be able or want to navigate, make a course correction and then get back on course. The moral issue of nuclear weapon possession and usage was one such obstacle for Mr. Graham. Though he made a course correction, all along he kept his passion for the mission to which he sensed he had been called. Finally, when encountering obstacles along the way, and we do encounter significant obstacles, some of which are large, huge, conserve your emotional and your spiritual energy for the obstacles that really matter. Passionate spiritual leaders are clear about their priorities. Passionate spiritual leaders are clear about the goals that matter and where to make significant emotional and spiritual investments. One of my primary functions as the Bishop Suffragan for the Armed Services and Federal Ministries of the Episcopal Church is to recruit clergy to serve as chaplains in the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, and in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. All three of these vocational expressions are so demanding, so intense, that I've adopted mandatory standards of evaluation for my applicants, that there must be indicators of a passion for the ministry in which they have expressed interest. When I use the word passion, let me say as something of a footnote here, I want to make the distinction. Though passionate leaders will occasionally express excitement about their missional commitments, excitement need not be the constant companion for passion. I'm looking to see if the applicant has a passion that manifests itself in a singular commitment to mission. One particular biblical image used by Jesus in the 9th chapter of Luke is something I have used as an evaluative tool. In that chapter of Luke, Jesus is speaking to some wannabe followers. You may remember this lesson. And he seemingly gives a very stern response to all the wannabes, saying, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." In other words, applicants for these ministries must be so passionate for their aspirational ministry that they can't take their eyes off the goal, that they cannot do anything else but engage in this ministry. On the other hand, if our applicants are walking forward and at the same time looking back over their shoulders, wanting the safety of an escape route or the safety of the shore in order to avoid being in deep water, then perhaps the applicant's not ready for the demands of the vocation. Spiritual and missional leaders will have a strong passion for their craft. The second formative component of spiritual leadership I want to talk about is to have missional acuity, the likes of which was described by H. Richard Niebuhr. In particular, those of you who know Niebuhr well, you know what I'm talking about, his 1951 book, Christ and Culture. At the outset, I need to say that though authors such as D.A. Carson and Craig Carter have seriously critiqued and questioned the applicability of Niebuhr's transformational model in postmodern and post-Christendom eras, still I think Niebuhr's 60-year-old plus offering has a significant value for us as a model of what it means to be grounded in a mission focus. The critiques of Niebuhr's call for transformational engagement are accurate and they're helpful. His work was largely based in the culture of the Christendom dominated by America in the 1940s and the 1950s. Some of the critical conclusions have been that Niebuhr's transformational model is outdated. There are numerous reasons why the older transformational model may not work for us today. One thing is, in a Christocentric society, only occasional accommodations and recognitions were made for the minority religions of the day. Today, we live in a vastly different domestic and global culture. Today, many of the conventional, traditional structures in society that are so monolithic have begun to fail us and no longer work in the postmodern, post-Christendom era. We are experiencing a culture in which it's almost impossible to comprehend the extensive dimensions of religious diversity. For example, I describe the environment with which I engage the armed services and federal ministry episcopacy as pluralism on steroids. It's somewhat beyond belief if you come into it from the outside to just see how broad, how extensive the pluralism is. On the other hand, while we will be prudent to exert caution about how we apply a transformational model, I think it's been proven to be an important component within the much larger scheme of spiritual and moral leadership. Looking at the model Jesus used with the 12, I think there are transformational principles which transcend the relatively transactional model that Niebuhr embraced at the midpoint of the last century. As Bernard Bass wrote a couple of decades ago, it's helpful to consider the difference between transactional and transformational leadership. The transactional leadership is comfortable to enter the conversation that he or she is given and to start from there. If you start from a Christendom-based society, you've got a starting point. That's not a starting point for Christ followers today. The transformational leader will find a way, on the other hand, to change the conversation. Jesus was a transformational leader who was not only willing to engage only in the old and sometimes sad conversations of the day with his people, he was willing to change and desirous of changing their conversation. For the most part, we need to get beyond the thinking that we'll engage society in order to transform the culture of the public square into something that resembles an extension of what we do on Sunday morning. I see little evidence that Jesus intended to baptize the culture, but rather had a missional focus to challenge those who lived their lives out in the public square to a different way of thought and action. Two things about Jesus' leadership style have always stood out for me. The first is that Jesus was about that business of changing the conversation. Whether Jesus is talking to a woman at the well, telling a parable about a landowner who planted a vineyard, or clearing the temple courtyard, he's changing the conversation. Though right and wrong and good and evil will always be pivotal and essential conversations whenever 2 or 3 people are gathered, there's always another very important conversation, and that important conversation is about the relationship between God and God's people and about the relationship amongst God's people. If spiritual leaders are going to elevate these relationships to a position of importance, the conversation has to be changed. Yet, Jesus knew that he couldn't do this alone. That leads me to the second principle Jesus used as a transformational spiritual leader. He was a charismatic leader who knew how to vest others with power. Eric Greitens is the author of Heart and Fist, The Education of a Humanitarian, the Making of a Navy SEAL. In this book, Greitens tells the story of when he was a student, a Rhodes Scholar who was completing his doctoral studies at Oxford University, became troubled by what he learned while he was doing field research. While he was in Bosnia and Rwanda, arguably 2 of the most unstable and troubled areas of the world, he was focused on helping homeless refugees, finding healing for the sick, and protecting the threatened. Now, though I honor and respect Eric Greitens' assessment, I recognize that his action plan may not be the one that everyone can endorse or would want to go into. Eric decided that someone was upstream throwing people into the river, and he could stay downstream forever and continue to do what he did, and people would still end up in the water. Eric decided that it was his duty to go up to the headwaters and stop the pain before it started. His action plan was to become a Navy SEAL so he could engage in the work that would stop the pain before it started and change the conversation. Eric is a 21st century transformational leader. Another one. Randy Haycock is an Episcopal priest and an Army chaplain. Until recently, Randy was assigned to the Wounded Warrior Unit at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. Day in and day out, Randy worked with wounded warriors, wounded Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, whose bodies all showed the marks and evidence of the wounds of war. In time, Randy began to realize that though there might be healing for the physical and the psychological wounds of war, unless he found a way to deal with their spiritual being, healing would always be incomplete. One of the noteworthy things Randy did was to address the spiritual needs of service members by developing a pilgrimage to Washington National Cathedral for wounded warriors. Randy's work was documented in a PBS Religion and Ethics News Weekly segment last year. Randy was aware that the wounds of war manifest themselves in a variety of ways. The conclusion that led him to action in a very unconventional way was that unless the spiritual needs of service members are addressed, they'll walk out the door to the hospital with intact bodies and severely fractured souls. Every month, Randy took the wounded warriors to the cathedral to spend directed time in a pilgrimage to look at their spiritual and moral wounds. Randy is another good example of the 21st century transformational leader. Eric Greitens made a conscious decision to change the way he responded to a culture of inhumanity. Randy Haycock decided to change the conversation about how human wholeness was going to be defined. Yet invariably it seems to me that in both of these cases the larger shift that still needs to be made is changing the conversation about war and violence before either ever begin. In the past, we've convinced ourselves that the conversation is between people of faith and people who make the decisions of state that send young persons and at times children into war. Today, I think that the shift in the conversation may be in the way people of faith talk amongst one another, because people at faith are at the bottom of a lot of what's happening. To get that new conversation started, we must have spiritual leaders who are willing to lead people into areas where the risk might be high, a risk that could call for significant vulnerability. To me, the value of Niebuhr's work is the challenge to consider how we will engage our culture. I believe that when I accept as valid the expectations for Christ followers to engage our culture, this presupposes that we're going to think through how and where and with whom we will engage the culture. Where and with whom do you need to change the conversation? Will your leadership style, decisions, and actions bring people into union with God? Is your leadership style a Christ-shaped leadership style? Are our cultural views and expectations based in God, based in an ontological, redemptive perspective to the created order? It has been important for me to remember that an engaging transformational leader must be a lifelong learner. Spending so much time of my ordained life outside of the normal institutional church, I've learned that almost everywhere I go, there are people from whom I can learn quality leadership. In an excellent book on leadership, retired Marine Corps General Tony Zinni says that leaders in the 21st century have to consider the effects of globalism upon every aspect and organization within the society, to include leaders of religious organizations. From an ecclesiastical perspective, our presiding bishop and my immediate superior, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, is for me an example of a leader who gets it when it comes to the demands of being a passionate, transformational leader who keeps the course. She understands the components and the requirements for spiritual leadership within the global community, within the religiously diverse world in which we live. And she understands the need to establish personal connections with the world's spiritual and political leaders. Just today, she and an entourage are off to the Far East, to the Philippines, to Korea, to talk about leaders there, about what the church is and what the church needs to be in order to bear witness to Christ. With passion, she understands the realities of where her leadership is to be focused. I believe that her focus, her spiritual focus, includes the premise that the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, the Triennial General Convention, and other related organizational entities, to include our theological seminaries, are supporting entities whose purpose it is to aid the episcopacies of the Episcopal Church, the dioceses of the Episcopal Church, the parishes of the Episcopal Church, to achieve their missional requirements. That those organizations have no other reason for being. Spiritual leaders need to have a strong sense of missional transformation. Finally, I'd like to describe what I mean by having the Anglican grounding and foundation of Richard Hooker. I recognize, well, I'm on a little bit treacherous ground here. Many of our forebears and contemporaries have issued cautionary words to those of us who would engage in this quest, the quest to give definition and description to Anglicanism. In 1959, Bishop Stephen Bain was appointed as the first executive officer of the Anglican Communion. Bishop Bain found in his work and extensive travels that the breadth of diversity amongst the provinces of the Anglican Communion was, to say the least, vast. During his tenure as the executive officer, there were those who thought that Anglicanism needed definition and unity, that the unity would come as the result of central organizing principles which could be adopted by all of the provinces. Sound a little familiar? When asked if this should be done, Bishop Bain's response was, "Don't. That way leads to madness. I've tried it. Take it from me. It cannot be defined." Well, with due respect to Bishop Bain's advisement, nevertheless, I'm going to trudge on ahead. I believe that we can find some basic principles to unite us, to set us apart, and have bearing upon how our leaders lead. I think that the competent spiritual leaders of our communion will have the foundational Anglican grounding that can be found in many of Richard Hooker's 16th century ideas. The late Urban T. Holmes, in his 1982 book on Anglicanism, described this in a threefold way, which is not going to be a three-legged stool, so don't get ready for that. Holmes' first indicator was sensibility, and I quote, "Sensibility requires a willingness to face the darkness of chaos without romanticism." As Anglicans, we are called to exercise courage in the face of darkness. When there is the chaos of darkness, the spiritual leader is the one who goes in first. That is, the leader will be called upon to take some of the risks, some of which might involve challenges to his personal safety. Second, the Anglican expression of Christianity is metaphorical. And again, I quote from Urban T. Holmes. "God is the creator of everything that is, and the knowledge of God requires only that we look at His handiwork." We are a people who can see God and the hand of God in the works of God, to include God's people. One of the things I repeatedly learn is how the face and image of God is repeatedly represented in prisoners and homeless people. On separate occasions within the last week, I spent time with one inmate in a prison and with another in a pre-release halfway house. As I watched their gestures and listened to their speech, to their words, to their descriptions of how God was working in their lives, I had no doubt that I was experiencing the work of God, God's handiwork in their lives. Finally, Anglicanism is comprehensive. Holmes says, the priority is for a dialectic quest over precision and immediate closure. In a world of sound bites, this may be a difficult concept to put into action. Even within our Anglican communion, we struggle with this. In a large part, that is the struggle we're having with the Anglican covenant. We're Christians who, for the most part, enjoy the freedom of dialogue. The dialogue we have had since we first entered into the process of discussion, I think, has been tremendous. Though there are those in our communion who would have us make our decisions because the Bible says, or the prayer book says, or the 39 articles say, my observation and experience is that the goods of Anglicanism are at their best when we can have principled times of listening and speaking with one another. Look how far we've come since we first began these conversations and discussions in earnest in 2004. I recognize that it may be uncomfortable for spiritual leaders to lead in a risk-dominated environment and listening more than they talk. Yet, the fine art of risk-taking and holy listening is the only process I know that will lead us to the position where we can recognize, honor, and respect one another, even when we disagree with one another. It may be that only when we stand before God and find perfection that we will all be of the same mind, and perhaps not even then. Listen to a passage from Hooker about sanctification, righteousness, and perfection. There is a glorifying righteousness of men in the world to come, and there is a justifying and sanctifying righteousness here. The righteousness wherewith we shall be clothed in the world to come is both perfect and inherent. That whereby we are justified is perfect, but not inherent. We are sanctified now. but not perfect. Spiritual and missional leaders in this communion will benefit by having a strong foundation in the basics of the Anglican tradition. In conclusion, I am advocating that our Christian leaders, whether in holy orders or not, need to have the skills and capabilities of a Graham, a Niebuhr, and a Hooker. That the synthesis of their ideas will form leaders into a mix of inclinations, and that these inclinations will form them into spiritually centered leaders who know and who understand the missional needs and opportunities before them, and who inspire and empower God's people. There is a new course to be charted. These creative leaders will be capable of and inclined to frame the spectrum of our local and global opportunities so as to chart new courses and create new pathways to live out the mission before us. Though I'm fairly certain that the charts and maps for this new journey, for this new excursion, have not yet been drawn, our life situation is such that we don't have the luxury of waiting for all the maps to be placed in our hands before we launch onto the journey. Yet we have some strong hints about where we must go, and they're all around us. Those such as Phyllis Tickle, Brian McLaren have given us ideas. Those who are writing and challenging us to regain our missional theology and to act on that missional theology have also given us ideas. Spiritual leaders need to be asking some pivotal, orienting questions today about how and why and what and who and where. We operate in a world that is very much different than what we have seen before. The world of religious diversity and pluralism is very different. The differences between what we do in the temple and what we do in the public square can be vast, but we still have an opportunity to engage in the public square. We need to have leaders who know and who understand the fine pieces and parts of the First Amendment to the Constitution and what can and cannot be done legally and appropriately within the public square. Though we hear the tempters in society encouraging us to hearken back to the comfort and the safety of a Christendom-based society, I think that we will be well advised to seek the future, to embrace the horizon in front of us, rather to engage in a frustrating and impossible effort to recreate the past, a spiritual Camelot that may or may not have ever existed. Though at times it will be tempting to seek the safety of the shore, to stay in port, the mission of God's people can only be accomplished when we put out to sea in the deep waters. The nexus of the passion for Christian mission and the consistency of the Anglican worldview is found when the culture is engaged in appropriate, challenging, faithful, transformative ways. This is, I believe, the leadership challenge to which our Christian leaders are called during these opening decades of the 21st century. Thank you.
Questions? And I've been told I need to repeat the question for the recording process. So, questions for Jay? They're speechless.
I hardly believe that.
Yes, over here. Thank you.
I think that there are, and one of the, you're supposed to repeat the question. I'm sorry, I'm jumping.
The question is, where are, in the Episcopal Church, where does he see these challenges being addressed?
I'll just start right within the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. We are having a new day in DFMS right now. We're looking at missional opportunities in ways we've never looked at them before. We're trying to find ways that the people on the staff of the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society can do this rather unique thing of letting people in the diocese, in the parishes, and the bishops know that the DFMS really does work for them to help encourage and support their mission. It is not the job of the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society to put together programs that no one needs and no one asks for. I think that our leaders today understand that pretty clearly. And we're starting to have some good rapport about that to try to find new ways of supporting mission that's faithful. And, you know, I can't go through all the dioceses where that's happening, but certainly it's happening in a lot of places. I can speak much more for the episcopacy that I serve, where I see it happening. I serve a group of about 160 missionaries who are actually doing missionary work. You know, very much in the model of St. Paul going on missionary journeys, or looking at Bishop Jackson Kemper in the 19th century, going out into people, living with them, engage where they are. It's rather remarkable to see what they do and how lives can be changed by doing that. But this whole idea of missional theology is starting to catch on, I think. We've got a ways to go, but I think there's a great future out in front of us.
Other questions? Sean.
Thank you, Bishop. It's a wonderful talk. I am not yet ordained, so I'm not going to speak like I am, but from what I understand from those that are, is that the demands and the needs of the parish are great.
Yeah.
And although I share your passion for mission, and I believe you, the hesitancy I have in myself is, how do I manage the needs of the parish and all that the leaders in the church are asked to do in their parish, and the ways that they're stretched to finding time to nourish what is necessary to proclaim that, to fulfill that mission. What advice do you give to the parish priest?
Well, Jesus found pretty quickly he couldn't do it all on his own. He had to have 12 very competent leaders. Not all of them who were that competent at the very beginning, of course. And not all of them who had good transformational, missional thoughts in mind either. But we are in a place in life and time where the role of the parish priest, the congregational priest, is changing rapidly. I'm hearing phrases like bivocational clergy, bivocational priest, like it was back in the early 70s when we thought we first discovered that, which we didn't, of course. The whole idea of bringing together communities of people, as some dioceses have done. I mean, we've got dioceses that have the bishops are being parish priests as well. We've got that happening in 2 separate dioceses right now, and there may be more that happens. And that's a model for us to be able to spread out our abilities and share the missional opportunities with other people. It requires a lot more faithfulness about sharing mission. One of the things that I did when I was here in the seminary was had an opportunity in the January term. I think it was the second January term that I experienced. We went down to what was then the Church of the Redeemer in Houston. Some of you may remember the old Church of the Redeemer down there, lived in community. Went down there and lived in community for a month. I learned 2 things. One is, I am not cut out for this. The other is, I learned about the tremendous power and capability for mission execution you can have when a group of people actually come together. When they understand that the leader is supposed to empower the people. That's what a charismatic leader does, to empower them and help them to find their abilities and move on. No longer can we adopt this old Christendom model and try to use this old Christendom model that the leader does it all and everybody else just shows up. It won't work. And there are lots of people who are experimenting with new models of that. The fact that you're a little bit anxious about that, is that fair to say? That's good. That's good. If you weren't anxious, I'd probably worry about you. You ought to be anxious. But I think the anxiety can be turned into some real energy that can be used for change, positive change with God's people.
Other questions? Okay.
Well, you used the example of Billy Graham. You talked about how he dressed the nuclear arms
Yes.
and then kept the state the course. What I'm wondering is, it seems like some of those things to which we should speak in the public square, the line between the course that we're called to keep and the moral public question is close together.
Yeah.
And that you can't really separate staying the course from continuing to speak to the moral issues. I mean, an example might be the plight of people due to the economic disparities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how you see that sort of, Billy Graham kept the course by focusing on an evangelical message about salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Where he didn't really continue talking about the dangers of nuclear war.
Right. Right.
What do you have to say to
Yeah.
leaders who really
Yeah.
have to keep speaking
Yeah.
to this problem in a moral way?
Well,
Can't sort of go off
I've got you.
back to the message.
Yeah, I've got you. I understand. And there is something of a dilemma in that. I understand, especially when you feel called to one thing and torn to another. The only way that I've been able to approach that is to say, and I have two responses to you, is to say that some of us are called to different things, and there are others who can take that up. The second thing is that one of the things I noticed that happened after Billy Graham did that was the conversation got started in the evangelical community. And to my memory, there had never been a conversation in that. And you have people like John Howard Yoder coming out and coming along afterwards, and his voice was really strong. I think John Howard Yoder and others took up that mantle and were able to speak to that, and as people are today. But it is a dilemma. It's not simple. It's not simple, and I think that's part of the dialectic we sometimes have to enter into with ourselves and our souls, and that's why I think much to I think Mr. Warren's chagrin, the letter I quoted, that the spiritual development and the action piece really have to go hand in hand and be balanced out there, so that we look in ourselves and get validated within our communities about what we do and how we will act out our Christian lives. But it's a tough thing. It's not always very clear, is it? No. You're welcome.
Anyone else? Very good. We're going to. Yes. Sorry.
I would just like to hear more about the National Cathedral. What goes on there?
Sure.
The question is about pilgrimages to the National Cathedral by the wounded veterans, I believe.
Fortunately, you can go to the website of PBS Religion and Ethics News Weekly, and the clip is still there, available. But Randy would in civilian dress, would take, every month, he'd take anywhere from 12 to 20, I think what he told me was, about 12 to 20. He would spend the entire day at Washington National Cathedral from 9 until about 3 and lead them on a pilgrimage there, going around to different sites in the cathedral, spending a lot of time in the War Memorial Chapel to think on and to meditate on what had happened, what they had seen, what they had heard, and how they responded to it are the three biggest things. And I know what that does to you when you have to stop and think about that. What you don't know about me is that what started probably my journey and my pilgrimage into ministry in the Episcopal Church was an opportunity to stop and think about what I was doing when I was a young enlisted man in Vietnam in 1969. I did not have a foxhole conversion. Don't think I did. And sometimes I guess those happen. And there are atheists in foxholes. I believe that. But to stop and think is such great value, especially when you've got someone directing you on what you've done. one of some of the terms that we're hearing to talk about veterans now, the wounded warriors are, and I used a couple of them, the fractured soul, morally wounded, moral wounds, spiritual wounds. It's only within the last 3 or 4 years we've even been able to talk about that. I know as a Vietnam veteran, not only did we not talk about that, we didn't talk about it, period. But we have folks who are willing and able to talk about that in a constructive way. Randy is one of them. He's an absolute gem. He can come work on my team any day. I wish I had 100 of him. But it's a remarkable thing. Look at that video. You'll be impressed, I think. It's Religion and Ethics News Weekly. Go to pbs.org and then go to the Religion and Ethics News Weekly pages. You may even be able to see my picture in some of those things, too, because I did a few things with them. Yes, ma'am.
Tara? Do we have a lot of Episcopal chaplains serving in the armed forces, I think is the question.
Yes. Not near enough. Not near enough. We have about half of what we need right now. I inherited this situation, and my commitment is to increase our numbers by at least 100% in 5 years. I've been public about that commitment. We're well on our way to doing that, and we may achieve that within 3 years. The reason I want to do that is for the most part, what I have described tonight is the type of leader I want to see, particularly in the armed services. I want to see them in the Department of Veterans Affairs. I want to see them in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but I want to see them in the armed services. As some of you are probably aware, we've had a just absolute landslide of moderate to extreme evangelical chaplains who have joined the ranks of the military. There are, and you'll appreciate that here in a seminary environment, there are some significant diploma mills out there that are doing complete online educations with no classroom experience and no pastoral experience and putting people into the armed services. They look at us and think that we are just absolute Attila of the Huns because we want to have such strict requirements to have an MDiv mostly in residence, to have 3 years of parish experience or pastoral experience, to be a fully ordained priest after 2 of those years, and to have all the concurrences before I'll give an ecclesiastical endorsement. Because I want someone who's formed, because I want the type of voice within the Department of Defense to be there that our people can bring. We bring a completely different conversation to the forefront, and I'll throw our Evangelical Lutheran Church in America chaplains into that same category with us. We, as a body of people, bring a completely different voice to the discussion there, and we're able to change the conversation from time to time. I'm looking for a group of people who are good conversation changers, who can speak to the needs of humanity in a different way, who can influence the leadership of the organization. I'm looking for people who can work their way up through the ranks of the chaplaincies so they can have a full career and be in dialogue with the most senior leadership in the Department of Defense. That's a long way off, but you have to plan today to do that. And we'll achieve our goal. I expect that in 3 or 4 years from now, I'll be talking about 250 to 300 chaplains in the armed services.
There's a question up here, yes. Yeah. Blue shirt. Yeah.
Hi, I'm an evangelical Lutheran pastor, and I've worked with Daryl Morton, your colleague.
Used to be my colleague. He's resigned.
I'm out of the mix. I'm a hospice chaplain. But I'm curious about this being a pivotal conversation starter. I found that it was very difficult to do in the midst of a great mass of evangelical right-wing leaders.
Yep.
In my class that I was with. But the hardest thing wasn't working necessarily there, because that was actually kind of fun when they found out that Christians can be kind of fun. But the more difficult thing I found was in a
it can also be damaging.
And damage.
Yeah, you've got it. You've got it. It's risky business. It sure is. It's risky business. But it's a business, it's a vocational expression that I don't think we can shy away from. We have to have competent people in there who will ask those questions, whether it's with evangelicals or with the leadership. And it takes experience to learn the organization. When a clergy person comes into a parish ministry after having graduated from seminary and being ordained deacon and priest in the Episcopal Church, if you will, you don't know everything right away. You really don't know the organization. You may think that you do, but it takes a while to learn the organization, to learn where the pressure points are, to learn where you can go and can't go, where you can influence the organization. I believe for military chaplains, it takes at least 4 to 5 years to learn the organization in order to be effective. And that's for well-formed people. If you don't put well-formed people in there, though, what happens is they go native and they start going off in some strange ways. It happens in the military. It also happens in parish ministry. We've seen that. I mean, when I was canon of the ordinary, I used to see that with people who weren't well-formed. They made bad decisions. They engaged people in the wrong way. It's hard. It's challenging. And if you do the wrong thing, you can do career-ending things in federal ministries. But I think the voice has to speak. We have a message.
Yes, sir, right here.
Given what we're talking about with your one, and I've seen that compared to Billy Graham and significantly nuanced understanding of evangelism.
Evangelism, as I see it, is being someone who's willing to start the conversation of listening and listening to people and enabling people to have a space to talk about their spiritual lives. You start the conversation and then you listen. In the public square, that's the only approach I know that works. Our colleagues in some of the other evangelical traditions have looked at it as in a different way. I don't think we have the right to pray in Jesus' name only every time you turn around, for example. You do if you're involved in faith community, specific faith community things. But I think we have to have the opportunity to start the conversation and then to listen to people. That's what the evangelical moments that my chaplains report to me of being able to have with people are very significant. For the most part, they're working with young people, 19 to 26 years of age for the most part, who have no experience of being in a faith community, who may have never been in a church before in their lives, who don't know anything about the Holy Scripture text that we know about, who may not even say they don't care. But we give them the opportunity to have the conversation as well. And I look at the evangelical outreach in a much more nuanced way. The last degree I got was from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and they look at things a little bit differently than I do. And for me, that was a challenge to be there in that type of community, to bring something else to the picture.
Barclay?
I hope this is helpful. As you talk, I think Joseph of Arimathea may be the example. Whether it's engaging with the evangelical community, whether it's engaging with those who wear the mantle of power, whatever it may be, if Joseph had not been who he was, if he had not engaged the culture and even through the previous part of it, he never could have walked up to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus.
Yeah.
It's engaging, it's walking that fine line between the engagement but not going native to the extent that we can't be there transformation.
Joseph of Arimathea is a great example because Joseph of Arimathea knew how to live in two worlds and live completely and found that creative tension to be productive. For some people, the creative tension is just too much. They want to go one way or the other. I'm looking for people who will not only live with the creative tension like Joseph of Arimathea, but will embrace it, because it's the opportunity to get where we need to get, to be where we need to get. How many of you are aware that we have an Episcopal priest Navy chaplain, and I shouldn't even say this, he'll probably kill me for saying it, who works in the White House military staff? We do. I cannot tell you his name, but we do. And that chaplain, because he's a career Navy chaplain, has, on occasion, access to the Commander-in-Chief. If he hadn't said yes, we wouldn't have that input. And it's honoring what Frank Sagano taught me out in the Breezeway. I recognize that doesn't mean that we run the show. But you have access to and input for. I will tell one tidbit of information that you may or may not appreciate. Our chaplain once had a conversation with the president and told him he probably ought to ratchet back his Christianity because it's going to get in his way sooner or later.
Yes, Jerry.
My question has to do with the day-to-day work of the chaplain in relation to the atmosphere of the military today as compared to Vietnam era, as we both shared, where we're told to go home and shut up.
You talk to the same people I talk to.
The question is about the difference from Vietnam to today in returning home.
Well, actually more than that, because the suicide rate today is almost triple what it was in Vietnam. The PTSD rate is probably quadruple what it was.
So the question is,
How are the day-to-day chaplains dealing with those issues?
frequently they are some of the only people who are dealing with the issues. If we as an Episcopal church are not able to put well-trained, competent, well-formed clergy in those situations, along with our call to common mission partners, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, a lot of that's not going to be done. I was just this morning with two of our chaplains up at Fort Hood who were in the Family Life Center program there. They're family life professionals. And we had this conversation about what they're able to do. Suicide rate, you cited the suicide rate. Suicide rate is starting to come down. Family violence and violence against women is going up at the same time. And against a group of people who previously have not had a voice in the organization. That's where our chaplains can give voice. During the period of time, when the tumultuous period of time of the lifting of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, our chaplains had significant roles behind the scenes of seeing to it that administratively and pastorally got implemented without hurting people. I can't tell all the stories there, but those are some of the influential things our clergy are able to do. And it's because of the formation that they have. They understand the environment. They may not understand the organization yet, but they understand the environment.
Yes, in the back there. That's Scott.
What is the process to discern a call to chaplain?
First, you ought to talk to me. Person ought to talk to me. And we will help a person go through that discernment process. We have an application process, and I jokingly say it's about 1/4 of what a commission on ministry does, to give you some idea. But we have a discernment process that we take people through and help them evaluate their call. The very first thing I'd say is I would go to a person and say, once you've met all the qualifications, can you read that Luke 9 passage about putting your hand on the plow and not looking back? I have turned back since I've been in this episcopacy 4 people because they wanted to look back. And you can't do that. You are going to have to leave home. You are going to have to leave everything that's familiar to you and go out and go do and be with people. And if that's not a passion for you, if you can't meet that passion need to begin with, and clear commitment, probably not ready to go. But I don't do that at the outset. Neither do the members of my staff. Neither do the members of my applicant review committee. We've got about 8 people on our applicant review committee in Washington who work with this, and we have meetings every quarter with applicants. We've got next week. I've got 8 new applicants coming in. We'll spend the whole day at Washington National Cathedral, in an office with them. Thank you.
Bishop, we are actually streaming live and have a question online.
Oh, all right. Go ahead.
Do you think that we are prepared as a church to have missional leaders break some institutional eggs?
It's going to take time. By that I mean we have a number of entrenched institutional pieces within the church that probably are not serving us very well. We need to make some changes in the Episcopal Church, I believe, from where I sit, in order to get ourselves around in the direction of and pursue of real mission work in the church. But we also have a lot of inertia within the church today that wants to maintain institutions within the church that don't serve us well today and probably only last served us when we were a Christendom-based society. I think once we start understanding that we are in this postmodern, post-Christendom era, we're going to have to make some changes. I've cited Phyllis Tickle and Brian McLaren, both of whom have cited the seismic shifts that are about to occur, and if we will take advantage of them, we can prosper as a church. Now, when I say prosper as a church, I mean prosper in terms of pursuing the mission that God has given us to pursue. It may not add a lot of numbers to people in our parishes. It may not increase the every member canvas campaign and give us more money. It may not help even in development. But I'm not so sure that that's the best indicator of what it means to be fulfilling mission.
We have time for one more question if someone has another question. Okay. In just a minute, we're going to have the big reveal. We're going to open the doors for a reception, and Jay will be with us, and you'll have the opportunity to visit with him at greater length. But Jay, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Peter, yeah, thank you. As you're coming in, everybody's invited to join us for the reception. I do want you to notice that we've got some wonderful literature on the Major Gifts campaign, the campaign for leadership that we just announced. I hope you'll all take a moment and get some and take it home with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bishop.